as well as this, because there is a very fine line in modern-day warfare between being a murderer and being a hero. It's much less clear-cut than it might once have been in this sort of post-Clausewitzian type of war.
Yes, and we'll go on to talk about that in terms of the movies, but what do you make of the idea that we are having these theatres, in a sense, and then often it ends up in the theatre for Richard Norton Taylor, for example. But what does it actually, does it help us as a society?
I think there's two things about that. I think there's one of it is, it's a messy war. We want a conclusion, and I think we also want either an apology or a confession. And I think that in a way that's why these things are happening, really, because I don't think we're going to necessarily find anything out that's going to challenge the preconditioned opinions anyway. What I thought was interesting about watching Brown, though, was comparing it to Blair, was that when you watch Blair, you get a sense that this is the guy for whom this is where the buck stopped, and he seems physically haunted by it. I think Brown basically just wants to kind of make sure that he doesn't get tainted by it 2 months before an election. So if he can walk away having bored people or not having no one landing a killer punch, that's success for him, I think.
Interestingly, of course, in a lead up to the election, of course, he put himself forward for the inquiry. Rather, it wasn't necessary that he appeared in the inquiry for the election. Tactically, looking at his performance there, was that a good decision?
Well, he knows he's good at this stuff. He knows that he can handle the select committee, the parliamentary committee, a panel of people sitting in front of him like that. He stonewalls them, he's brilliant at it, and he doesn't really answer the questions and nothing is concluded.
I mean, simply trying to remember or find a memorable quote out of the session is much harder than it has been with Blair, etc. So I think in that sense he'd probably think it was quite successful, because we're not going to feel quite as he's not going to feel quite as tainted by it as
I thought at some point in the inquiry one person would have said, did you or Tony Blair ever receive any phone calls from the 202 area code in Washington, D.C. pertaining to the weapons of mass destruction? That was the question that I would have liked to have seen. The special relationship, anything about that? But no, the questions were, he knew what the questions would be, and he handled them well.
Well, we'll find out in a few weeks' time if Green Zone is a box office hit, and we'll know on Sunday if Hurt Locker is an Oscar winner. If it does scoop Best Picture, it'll be the first war movie to do so since Platoon 25 years ago. And despite critical acclaim, Hurt Locker will be one of the lowest earning winners. Despite many attempts, why hasn't there been a commercially successful Iraq war movie yet?
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
War movies have been a Hollywood staple.
You fight good for a tourist.
Even the vastly unpopular Vietnam conflict eventually produced two Best Picture winners, Platoon and The Deer Hunter.
I hope they sent us where the bullets are flying.
Right.
Fighting's the worst, huh?
But despite the recent success of the Oscar-tipped Hurt Locker and the satirical In the Loop, audiences have largely turned their backs on cinematic efforts to capture the drama of the Iraq conflict. Glory has been in very short supply, and this feel-bad tone was exemplified in Brian De Palma's faux documentary Redacted, Nick Broomfield's gritty battle for Haditha, and the soul-searching drama In the Valley of Elah, all inspired by real-life reports of dark deeds by the US military. Despite its acclaim, if Hurt Locker does win Best Picture on Sunday, it will be one of the smallest grossing winners in recent history. But even if the audience's appetite remains questionable, filmmakers are fascinated by the conflict. The upcoming Messengers follows those whose job it is to inform the families of bereaved soldiers, while Ken Loach's Route Irish, set in Baghdad, is due in autumn. It should be remembered that seminal films about the Vietnam War were not made until several years after the conflict ended. We may have some years to wait before we see an Iraq classic. But Saf, you know, for a filmmaker, a war, especially a war and a series of wars after World War II, where there are shades of goodies and baddies, writers and directors like these kind of things, whether the audience likes them or not.
Yeah, but you usually like to know what the story of the war is before you can start trying to tell the story of it, I think. And I think that's why, you mentioned that it took a while before Vietnam ended up becoming a successful idea for a film. I think one of the problems with Iraq at the moment is that, we're so still locked in it, we don't quite know how it's going to turn out. So therefore, trying to work out what the story is out of it whilst you're still in it is quite a difficult one.
But they're individual stories, aren't they? Rendition, redacted. These are particular stories about particular events.
They are, and they are attempts to resolve this conflict we have about this war, which is a terrible war that we all, I would suggest, feel conflicted about. We all recognise that Saddam Hussein was a terrible individual that possibly had to be removed, and certainly people who were opposed to the war, like myself, have to recognise what it would have meant for the Iraqi people to keep him in place. There are all sorts of terrible conflictual feelings that are happening about this war, and in a way, I think what we end up with is Joe may be right that that it is too late to look into some of these problems, but actually it's kind of too soon, really, for us really to have a proper
But isn't it the type of war that actually won't be resolved? I think that's the problem. It's reflecting this new type of war. You know, where once you had two armies fighting each other, now it's more like drug dealers on street corners in lots of ways. You know, the victims are always the civilians, battles are rare. Atrocities are many. It's the kind of thing that doesn't really conclude. It's not a very clear, it's not political ideology that's driving these things.
Are you sure about that?
Fairly, yeah.
I mean, you don't think that the reason you don't think that the Iraq War was dominated and partly shaped by political ideology?
Not dominated by, partly shaped by, yes. But I think it's so much more complicated than that now.
Yeah.
And I think these films reflect that. The films are so much messier and more complicated than Second World War films.
Redacted and The Battle for Haditha are daring movies. They're really raw movies, and they didn't do well. So the two movies that have come out, The Hurt Locker, which will probably lose to Avatar, but which could win, and the movie we just talked about, The Green Zone, both of them have at least one character. Well, Matt Damon's the hero, and Jason Isaacs and Greg Kinnear are the bad guys. And in The Hurt Locker, there are the other foils to the guy who likes to explode bombs. So so the movie's basically about our soldiers are doing a good job there. They're locked in a horrible war.
Even if you're a liberal and you don't like the war, you can go for it.
The Hurt Locker is actually about what it starts with, which is this idea of people being addicted to drugs, addicted to war as if it is a drug. And I mean, I thought it was actually a fantastic film, but again, it wasn't very political.
But it gives the audience, but what it does do, I suppose, is gives the audience a kind of, in their own boots on the ground way, a kind of visceral experience of what it must have been like to be. I mean, we've had so many deaths of IED operators that it gives them that feeling.
And it does do that, but I think there is a deep political element to The Hurt Locker. I think it's a deeply conservative film, a deeply reactionary film. It's a very beautifully contained film. The vision is very clear, but in fact we come out of it with a very familiar idea of soldiery, which suggests that, in fact, the reason that men do this stuff, the reason that men get addicted and have this adrenaline rush is because they can't really handle the kind of banality of domestic life.
Only the one character, but not the other ones. And there was a movie made 50 years ago called The War Lover with Steve McQueen, which is about a guy who just loves dropping bombs on the Germans. And this is just like this. This guy gets a rush from this. And Steve McQueen was a villain in that movie. But in this movie, the other characters who were part of that group are not addicted to this. They want to go home to their families.
Yeah, and also reversing our way through the Vietnam movies, they don't even have that. They just have the damage, in a sense. If you look at Deer Hunter, and also look at Apocalypse Now, it is not, well, partly Apocalypse Now is about the addiction to war, but it's hugely about the damage.
It's also about the consequences when you come back as well, and I think that's something else which some of the more Iraq films are doing, which is not just the consequences in the arena, but the consequences when you return. But it just strikes me that this essentially becomes films about soldiers and war rather than films about Iraq.
I don't think that's quite true. We've all seen a lot of them this week, and we're all talking about the soldiers and the politics and the WMD, but actually, the first one that I saw of this lot, which was Green Zone, when it starts, I was in tears within 40 seconds, because what all these films do so well, I think, is the enormous, it's the Rupert Brooke poem, I think, the pity of it all. And they do all do that so well. And the ordinary Iraqis and the ordinary people who are just suddenly exploded in the street.